Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Bank Robbery. Hello there. Do you remember the story of the Great Bank Robbery? It was headline stuff back in the 20s. As far as we can check our records, it's the one and only bank robbery that Harbor ever had. You see, the harbor is pretty well down here in a bottleneck, and the chances of anyone making a big holdup and getting away are pretty thin. It's not like the Midwest where a bandit gang can escape in any direction. Not this one. If a stick-up artist pulled a job here, he would have his choice of running for the beaches to stick his head in the sand dune, starting around the Olympic Loop, hustling down to Raymond, or taking a road past the sheriff's office in Montesano. And a hack in 1924, he had just half as many choices. There was no Olympic Loop Highway, and there was no Raymond Road. That's why it was headline news that someone had tried to hold up the Aberdeen Bank. So when Dick is taking his customary few seconds for our sponsors, we'll be back to open the pages of our scrapbook to the story of the Great Bank Robbery on Heron Street. All right, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. It was just a few minutes before noon, the last day of 1924, that the police alarm in downtown Aberdeen seemed to go crazy. They started to ring, and rang for 3 minutes by actual count. Every one of the clanging gongs going at once, the lights flashing, and the minions of the law dashing down the street at a breakneck pace. Of course, the town turned out to see what had made the upset in the midday quiet of the December 31st day, and thereby hangs on the story. You see, in 1924, the Aberdeen National Bank was located on Heron Street, just west of the Bijou Theater. It was one of 3 banks in town. 3 of them, Hayes and Hayes and the Grays Harbor National Bank, were the other 2. Charlie Albertson was the prime mover behind the institution, and Norman Bruin was the right bower. It was a solid little bank that gave a substantial measure of public service and was one of Aberdeen's last home-owned banks. Now, about 11:45 that morning, and some of the employees were about to put on their coats and go to lunch, a little man carrying a paper bag and wearing a slouch hat down over his eyes entered the bank and looked around. There was only one customer in the place, Cliff Carman, a resident of Aberdeen, who made his home at 511 North Broadway, was standing at one of the wicketed windows picking up the proceeds of a check he had just cashed and folding the bills. The little man seemed to hesitate, as though he was not accustomed to banks, and he stopped in front of the desk of Albertson and Bruin and then dropped his paper bag. It crashed on the floor, and its contents, which turned out to be rice and cheap candy, spread over the floor in a cascade. Everyone in the bank turned to look at him, which apparently was exactly what he had hoped for. He whisked a gun from his pocket and brandished it at Albertson and Bruin, shouting, "Give me $2,500 and be quick about it." Lee Stout was in the window nearest the gunman, and he seemed to be the focal point of the little man's attention. It was not Lee's window, but Grace Reeder had just gotten back to get her coat and leave for lunch. Lee had taken over. He looked over at Bruin, who nodded his head. Stout picked up the cash on the counter and pushed it through to the stranger. The stranger scooped it up and thrust it into his pocket. Then, backing towards the door and waving the gun, he made a hurried exit. Albertson leaned towards the window and saw him start west down Heron Street. Carmen and Ruth Minkler, an employee of the bank, ran out onto the sidewalk and saw the robbery hurry into the Broadway pharmacy across the street. And as they saw him enter, Heron Street was being deafened with the bang and clang of the police alarm. Now, as the holdup had been in process, another drama with a thick atmosphere of detective thriller was taking place in the back of the bank. Dorothy Ryder, Ruth Minkler, Vera Carlson were back in the accounting department of the bank when Dorothy Ryder whispered, "The bank is being held up." Ruth and Vera hurried out the back door of the bank into the alley and went to Kaufman and Leonard's furniture store through the back entrance. They borrowed the telephone, and in a matter of seconds they had called the Aberdeen Police Department, and the sergeant, V.T. Cass, had heard Vera say, "The Aberdeen National Bank is being robbed." It was all the sergeant needed to hear. He reached over and he threw the switch that set the street alarms in operation. As he threw the alarms, the robber was just backing out of the door of the bank, and Ruth Minkler had returned to the bank to tell what she had done. Now, Officer Barry Allen had been pounding his beat in downtown Aberdeen that morning. He was due to be relieved at noon by Officer John Brooks. He met Brooks in front of the West Haven and Williams clothing store on East Heron Street, just as he was about to go in and investigate the sale of an overcoat that the store was advertising with a poster in the window. Brooks went in with him, and the two men were leaning on the counter, clattering with the clerk, when the alarm in the street outside began to jangle. Then they were ringing, and the number of them were setting a din told them that something was happening, and they dashed out of the store and over to the nearest police alarm box. Cass was waiting for them on the telephone. He passed the word, "There's a robbery at the Aberdeen National Bank." It was just 1 block west on the other side of the street. The two officers started down Heron Street on a double pace. Now, they were answering the telephone when little Pete Corse backed out of the bank. That was the robber's name, Pete Corse. He had been in Aberdeen just 48 hours when he tried to stick up that brought him fame for a long sentence. And the officers, known who they were looking for, they might have spotted him a block away. But Pete looked like anyone else, and when he backed out the gun in his pocket, he turned very nonchalantly and walked across Broadway to the drugstore. So Officer Allen and Brooks stopped at the bank. They approached the bank carefully because, for all they knew, the stick-up was still in progress. But a glance inside and Carmen and Ruth Minkler running out told them that it was all over inside the bank. They took just time enough to get the description of the man, and then listening as Carmen and Ruth told them that the man had entered the Broadway pharmacy, they started for the drugstore on the run. Now, Aberdeen's police department of that long ago time was no slouch, as the town found out that day, for the two officers started for the drugstore. The police car drove up with Chief George Dean in it, and the three of them made their way towards the store on the corner together. 3 was the right number. There were 3 entrances to the store, one on the corner, one on Heron Street, and a back door on Broadway. Each of them took a door with the guns drawn, and they entered. Allen, who took the corner door, nearly fell over the robber as he came out flashing his gun. For the bold robber, who was for a few minutes before staged the only bank robbery in the history of Grays Harbor, and that in the daylight and without help was calmly lighting a cigar at the counter and picking up the change from a $10 bill that he used to push across and pay for his cigar. The pinch was a cinch. Pete Corse did not resist. The officer took his gun, the chief took the money, and within 5 minutes the stack of bills was back on the teller's desk in the bank, and the hold-up man was on his way to Aberdeen jail. Police Judge Bob Tackett mugged and printed the would-be robber, and Deputy Sheriff T.M. Quinn and Fred Lomax took him into custody and started him for the Montesano jail in a matter of about 15 minutes. And that was the end of the robbery, except what the harbor made of it. For days, rumors went around that the robber had been assisted by a gang and that the gang got away. Some said that the car sped away from the bank as Courier walked out, leaving him in the lurch. There was a story that had given up all the money and the rest was hidden somewhere around the entrance of the Broadway pharmacy, and the kids of the town went over the entrance with a fine-tooth comb. There was a report that little Pete's gun was not loaded. In fact, the harbor made a good thing out of the holdup. But if nothing else, the abortive stick-up proved a lesson to would-be bank robbers. For the story of the speed for which the gunman was nabbed made headlines all over the Northwest, and the net that had spread to take him in was revealed to the public. For hardly had the bells began to clang on Heron Street than Sergeant Cass had informed Hoquiam and Montesano, the only two ways out of town, of the impeding stick-up, and the police and sheriff's officers were preparing to barricade the highways and stop all cars. A detail from the sheriff's office was ready to search outgoing trains, and the police and sheriff's offices all over Southwest Washington were being alerted at that moment. That was probably why the Aberdeen police received so many congratulations on their quick work, and why Grays Harbor had to fall back on fiction to dress up the great bank robbery that was generally agreed to be the most fearless executed and the most porous plan that they had ever seen staged, and about as quickly cleared up as any on record. Now here's Dick Crombie and a few words from our sponsor. Yes, that was the great bank robbery that ended the year of 1924 in Grays Harbor. Officer Brooks resigned his position with the Aberdeen Police for that evening and accepted a better position with the Hoquiam Police Department. And the girls who had phoned in the alarm to the Aberdeen Police were the toast of the town. The little man who had tried to pull the holdup was lacking the glamour for those who sought to make a colorful story out of it. He had come north from San Francisco. He had spent 2 days in Elma eyeing the bank there, but decided it was too small and not worth it. He then came to Aberdeen, where he waited for 2 days before he tried the holdup. It was the first he had ever attempted, and the last. He went to state prison for Montesano. And, as we said, it was the first, last, and only bank robbery that we can find in our records of Grays Harbor, which speaks of either the inherent honesty of its citizens, its unattainable connection to the outside criminals, or something that is not apparent, but which helps to make the great bank robbery an event worth noting tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.